Strange but true stories. Tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. So, before we get to today's story, I wanted to say that I know it's been a long time since our previous SBT video dropped, and I'm sorry about that. Sometimes life gets in the way. Sometimes it's my full-time job. Sometimes it's other side projects that I've got going on. In this case, it was all of the above. I just wrapped production on 2 new audiobooks, which took a considerable amount of time to finish. Be on the lookout for the release of Project Renaissance White Wings by Brian Gates. It's a thriller set in the not-too-distant future, and it's a fun ride to take. Also, a true crime story set in 1990s Australia titled No Place for the Weak by Ryan Green. You may need a strong stomach for that one. It gets a bit gory in places, but it's a fascinating look into the mind of one of Australia's most prolific serial killers. Anyway, Project Renaissance White Wings, No Place for the Weak. Both those books are going to be on Audible in the near future if they aren't already by the time you watch and listen to this. And to fill in the gaps between SBT videos, check out my YouTube partner's new channel, Down the Rabbit Hole, True Mysterious Stories, that he hosts. It's got some similarity to what we do here, so give it a listen and a like. Okay, so that's out of the way. Thanks for your patience. Now here's today's story. 1990, Anchorage, Alaska. Emergency services received a call from the Eagle River Jail, north of the city, that a 70-year-old gentleman in custody there was in need of medical attention, and he may be in cardiac arrest. Paramedics arrived at the jail a few minutes later. The man was in obvious pain, but he was conscious and able to communicate while being treated, answering questions asked of him as best he could. To try to calm the man down a little as they continued taking his vital signs and assessing his condition, one paramedic asked if the man did any hunting or fishing. The old man nodded. The paramedic said that he had recently been hunting down south of there on the Kenai Peninsula in the Chatham Bay area. The man's eyes grew wide, and his pulse quickened, the beeps on the heart rate monitor. The older gentleman reached up, grabbed the collar of the medic, pulled a little closer, and then he asked, "Did it bother you? Did you see it?" Chatham Bay sits on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. It is a beautiful place with a relatively short history, but yet it may hold a dark secret. It was discovered, or at least noted, in 1786, when an English ship captain found shelter from a violent storm in the calm waters of the bay. But despite the beautiful scenery, shelter from a violent ocean, and what would be a most abundant hunting, trapping, and fishing area, Nathaniel Portlock, captain of the 320-ton vessel the King George, leading a fur-trapping expedition, no less, only stayed for a short period of time. It would be another 100 years before anything along the lines of civilization would find a footing there. In October 1867, the United States purchased Alaska and took possession of the territory. It wasn't long before men from all over the U.S. made their way to Alaska, with some settling onto the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. Small fishing villages began popping up, and then around the start of the 20th century, an American business brought in a fleet of fishing boats and established a cannery, cold stores, and smokehouses in the area, taking advantage of the abundance of salmon, cod, and halibut. In the early 1920s, the town was taking off. Enough, at least, that a U.S. post office was set up there. In 1928 and again in 1930, 2 additional canneries were built in Port Chatham. It was becoming a boomtown. But even before the post office and canneries were established, there was a growing feeling that something wasn't quite right around Port Chatham. There was an eerie feeling of being watched, sightings of a hairy creature in the thick woods and forests of the area. The Alutiiq people, who mostly inhabited this area and worked on the fishing boats and in the canneries, called this creature that haunted the area Nantinak, which roughly translates into half man, half beast. The Alutiiq people described the Nantinak as a deadly predator. It was a monster that actively hunted humans and killed for no obvious reason. A creature that they described as bigger than a grizzly bear and meaner than a wolverine. Some who fought back their fears, ignoring the warnings to stay out of the woods from those who had seen or heard the Bigfoot-like creature, traversed into the trees and then never returned. In 1905, a letter written from a resident of Port Chatham talked about the cannery and the small group of native people who lived and worked there. The letter writer mentioned that a hairy man was bothering and frightening them to the point that they had to leave the area quickly. The mass exodus of people scared by this creature was so great that the cannery shut down for a period of time until the owners of the facility agreed to hire security at the plant to protect the workers from whatever lurked in the woods. Slowly, people returned and new folks filled in the gaps. In 1931, a man by the name of Andrew Kamluck ignored the warnings, journeying into a thick copse of trees. He was never seen alive again. When a few men stumbled across his dead body, they saw that he had been struck and killed by a piece of log-moving equipment. The machine part turned murder weapon was 10 feet from the body, and it was way too heavy for one man to lift, not to mention too heavy to swing and land a blow to the back of the man's head where the killing blow had been struck. Not long after, a gold prospector and miner said goodbye to his family to go check on his claim. His family, and in fact, no one else, would ever see the man again, alive or dead. Men looking for him checked in and around his cabin near his claim. Nothing. They searched the area. No trace of him was ever discovered. Tom Larson ran a sawmill in the area. He ventured out to chop wood to build a new fish trap one day. As he raised his axe to take a blow at a suitable tree, his attention was caught by a big, hairy creature standing on two legs at the water's edge nearby. Stunned by what he saw, but now believing the local legend of the Sasquatch-like creature, he raced back to his cabin to grab his gun. When he returned to the spot, he saw that the hairy beast was still there, just looking back at him. It wasn't running at him, nor was it running away, but the creature was definitely aware of the man's presence. Larson didn't fire his weapon, and he remarked later he didn't know why. He just didn't. After a few more moments of intense staring, the hairy creature wandered off into a thicket of birch trees. Then in the 1930s and 40s, mutilated bodies of men who had ventured into the woods were discovered. Some had been dismembered in such a way that people believed there was no way a normal animal like a bear could or would have done it. Others found bodies washed up on the shore, again, mutilated and badly damaged. An unofficial tally of bodies found in this state of destruction was said to be around 36 in a span of 15 years. A hunting party went off to hunt moose. They found moose tracks and began to follow the trail for a mile or so. Then they noticed the prints of another creature, apparently stalking the same moose. A quick measurement of an 18-inch barefooted bipedal creature caused the men to grow concerned, but they continued to follow the now 2 sets of prints. It was a good bit further where they came upon a small clearing where there were obvious signs of a struggle, with the prints mangled together. The only prints that were seen to be moving away from the area were those of the bipedal, large-footed creature, now sinking into the snow deeper, as if weighed down by the 600- or 700-pound moose over its shoulders. By the late 1940s, the town had been abandoned, not because the resources had been all used up, but because people no longer wanted to live close to this mysterious creature. The post office shuttered its doors in 1951. Now, the Aleuts weren't truly dependent on the employment from the cannery in the same way as the Europeans or Americans who relocated to the area were. They had a different relationship to the land, and they wouldn't be as soon to leave as the immigrants from the South or Europe. So why did they go? In 1973, 3 bow hunters looking for goats near Cook Inlet got caught in a storm, and they were forced to take shelter in Dogfish Bay Lagoon. They pitched their green canvas tent not too far from the water where they had beached their skiff. Then they enjoyed a fresh salmon dinner and retired for the night. Around 2:30 in the morning, the men were awakened by the sound of what they described as a 2-footed person or creature circling their tent. The men had left their bows and their Alt-6 shotguns leaning against a tree outside of their tent. They cursed themselves for that, but they waited in terror as the creature eventually wandered back off into the thicket. The next night, the men had their weapons with them in the tent and were once again awakened by the sound of solitary footsteps approaching and then encircling their tent. The men finally gathered the courage to open their tent and confront whatever it was they were hearing. But when they turned on their flashlights and swiveled around, they saw nothing. Checking the ground for prints, they found nothing. All 3 had heard the distinctive sounds of something walking close to their tent, and yet they saw no evidence of it. On the 3rd night, the men waited for the creature to return, but they never heard any steps approaching their tent. The next morning, the weather had broken, and the men packed as quickly as they could. They did not discuss the event with each other or any friends or family for several years, until they began to hear stories of others who had run-ins with a creature in that same area. Port Chatham is an uninhabited ghost town. There are few, if any, remnants that would signal its history as a thriving place of business from a century ago. It's still a great place to go to fish the still water and to hunt in a wild and wide expanse of forested land. But just keep your eyes and ears open for the sound of an approaching bipedal creature. You just may turn around and come face to chest with the Alaska version of Sasquatch. This has been another strange but true story. So what do you think was going on in this Alaskan fishing community? Time now to tell us what you think in the comments below. If you have a strange paranormal story that you'd like to share with us, send it to us in an email with as much detail as you can provide to strangebutTrueStories2@gmail.com. We'll give it a read, and maybe you'll hear it here on SBT in a few weeks. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you would like to support us in other ways, check out Audible for the new releases I've got coming out that I mentioned earlier, Project Renaissance White Wings, written by Brian Gates, and No Place for the Weak by Ryan Green. Also, check out my YouTube partner's new channel, Down the Rabbit Hole. Thanks for all the support you've given us in the past. It's greatly appreciated. And thanks for watching this video. I'm Steve White. Until next time.